Hey guys, it's Den Den Kushi, and today we're going to be recapping some of the recent chapters, basically getting into the little details, going back, finding out what is actually going on before we move on to this whole Elbaf, Nami, Loki, Isekai mini-arc, introducing us to the grander arc of Elbaf. Okay, so without further ado, let's get into this. So, starting with chapter 1122, the title is The Time is at Hand. The cover page is Smoker. The reason for this is probably to bring up his relevance, as he's been away for a while and he's soon going to be coming back into the story, many of us believe. So the first panel is a reaction to Vegapunk on the big screen, and the narrator says the times are a-changing. Vegapunk says the fate of the world depends on pirates, which the crowd are kind of questioning. This is evoking the idea that, Joy Boy was the first pirate at the end of the Void Century, and he instigated the changing in times, and as a pirate, he was likely a hero. Additionally, we see Oda putting a lot of effort into the different pieces of clothing and fashion that we see. Lots of details going on in the panels. We see reactions from people around the world in different locations, and they're basically very, very shocked, they're very scared, and they're wondering if the Navy are going to protect them. Meanwhile, we see other reactions from pirates. Pirates seem very, very happy to hear this news, very motivated at the fact that the One Piece is very likely real, according to Vegapunk, who they all believe to be the smartest man in the world. Something that Oda shows us distinctly is a lot of the people that are kind of motivated, like I say, are prisoners, people that are stuck behind bars, and we are shown the guards that are kind of alarmed at the fact that all the prisoners are getting all riled up. At which point, an officer of the prison demands to know why the staff are letting the prisoners hear the message, but the staff reply that every snail in the prison is playing it. In other words, that's Oda telling us, there's no blocking this message. It's worldwide. Everyone's hearing it, even in prison. We also see a few ranking nameless marine officers that seem very dismayed at the fact that Vegapunk's telling the world the truth. And again, it's kind of like with Akainu's reaction, it almost seems like they kind of have an idea that this is true already. Next, we cut to a picture of Kube. Now, interestingly, in the middle of Kobe's hair, we see the little whale tail symbol. And in a recent anime episode, it literally spent like a good 8 seconds just showing Kobe's hair with this little two like bobbing up pieces of hair that make this whale tail symbol. I wouldn't usually bring up something so specifically detailed. However, ever since we saw Lilith and the whole Egghead situation with the flashbacks between Ginny and Kuma's mum, we just seem to keep seeing this weird hair like thing going on. And yeah, it's Oda, so it probably means something. Kube has a flashback basically to where he first met Luffy, and when he's questioning Luffy, like saying that he's stupid for wanting to get the One Piece. And then we see him basically committing to the fact that he needs to stop Luffy from reaching Laugh Tale. That is his goal, similar to what Garp was about. So we see Kube here reiterating the fact that he's inherited Garp's will, even though he's not Garp's grandson, which is very traditional of One Piece. The parents or the direct family usually aren't very parenting to their direct child, and instead children are brought up by sort of surrogate parents. A really good example of this, I think, that will be revealed is the fact that Rayleigh and Shaki are probably Mihawk's parents. However, we see when Shaki's revealed to be the previous Empress of Amazon Lily 2 generations ago, that Boa has her leg on Rayleigh's lap, all childlike. Next we have fan favourite Buggy, who's basically tearing up, talking to all of his underlings that pretty much make up the majority of Cross Guild, where we see his support really ramping up, and like the fact that like now it's less about Buggy lying and it's more about Buggy, he has no control out of it. It's grown out of hand. His followers have just become obsessed. After this, we cut to Katarina Devon, who's with Caribou, and she's basically asking Blackbeard, shall we unalive Caribou, or what should we do with him? But Caribou keeps pleading, saying that his information's super valuable. So Blackbeard tells Katarina Devon to bring him to Teach, and Teach then will decide his fate depending on the value of the information. Next, we cut to a very dramatic panel where Top Man in his hokey form has really bust up the Iron Giant's arm. The giants watch on, sort of supporting the Iron Giant, while basically chaos ensues, everything's exploding, things are on fire. And then we quickly cut to the Sunny flying off the edge of Egghead, flying through the sky out of Egghead, which, let's quickly point out, most people have predicted that we were going out of the top of Egghead and over the sort of surrounding battle or military. But while they're in the sky, NoChillDill jumps up into the sky at the ship, to which they reply, "Do something, Zoro," connecting Zoro with NoChillDill. Then Oda shows us 2 panels next to each other, which is Zoro pointing east, holding his blade, and NoChillDill pointing west, holding his blade. Additionally, we get a couple of reactions from the Straw Hats, and it's fascinating, right? We see Usopp and Chopper with their eyes popping out of their head. So Nika isn't directly interacting with them, but they are, going into the animated, style. Whereas the next panel is Nami, and she's holding her face and she's crying. Her eyes are intact, she's drawn like a proper person. So for some reason, Oda has shown us 2 reactions here. One, where 2 people are affected by the Nika transformation and they're animating, and one that isn't. Now, a lot of people might think that's a bit of a stretch. However, the 2 people that are shown reacting with their eyes popping out are Usopp and Chopper. And Usopp and Chopper are the 2 people that say they are scared to go to Long Ring Longland. And when they get on Long Ring Longland, they're the only 2 characters to stretch. So, what I'm saying is, here we might be seeing another example of how fear or how emotion affects certain characters. 2 of which have been affected completely by the Nika transformation, whereas Nami, who's crying maybe for a different reason, not because she's scared because NoChillDill's coming, but instead she's scared for Zoro, she is completely intact and she's drawn in detail. Next, we get the absolutely epic double panel of MF saying, "I'm sorry, Joy Boy." This is super interesting because it ties to, Zunisha was punished, right? So Zunisha assumably did something wrong. Ace's final words to Luffy were, "I'm sorry." MF here, pretty much his final words are, "I'm sorry" to Joy Boy. Joy Boy left an apology letter to Poseidon on the poneglyph. So we are really seeing that apologies seem to be a big theme in Joy Boy's old crew or allies. That's when Luffy appears in Gear 5, and MF says, "I want to apologize to you too," making a distinction between the OG Joy Boy that he knows and whoever he's seeing in front of him. He continues saying, "I knew there was no chance he would still be alive," again distinguishing Luffy from Joy Boy as different people. And Luffy does reply saying, "Did you mistake me for someone else?" That quote there, again, can kind of evoke what happened on Long Ring Longland with Tonji, where Tonji said, "Long time no see," and then Luffy says, "Wait, do you know me?" So we are starting to come full circle in this whole, 30-year journey. MF states that Luffy, as in Gear 5, is very, very nostalgic, and that it evokes feelings of the past. And then after which, MF really puts the nail in the coffin with the whole punishment vibes I mentioned with Zunisha, because he says, "I hope Joy Boy forgives me. I failed to make him king." Then we get an absolutely huge, beautiful panel of NoChillDill, Jupiter as his massive June sandworm thing, form, or verm as some people want to call it. We see Saturn on the edge of the island. We see the Hoki. They're all going towards the giant ship with just only Emeth stood between them. So it's not looking good for the giant ship at this point. Emeth asks what Luffy's name is, to which he replies, "I'm Monkey D. Luffy, the man who's going to be king of the pirates." At that moment, Emeth says D, and a knot comes undone from somewhere inside him, we assume. Then Emeth requests that he hears the drums of liberation for the last bit of his life, and then he tells Luffy not to die. Next thing you know, everyone's getting absolutely blasted to pieces by the intense haki that's inside the knot tied within Emeth. And the Gorosei are seemingly obliterated and reappear immediately in the throne room at Marijua. It's worth pointing out that Mars is already there from where he was beaten before. So this is Oda showing us how the Gorosei work, they're sort of the fact that they're like immortal or indestructible. And at this point, we get shown Emu screaming. Not only that, we also, for the second time ever, we get to see the nun-looking person in the room that's with Emu. And this person says Great Emu with 2 exclamation marks. They seem very, very concerned. Next is a panel of Emu's silhouetted face, and we see the eyes looking very concerned. We see her panting, and she says, Joy Boy. We also see a little shiver drawn. So for the first time ever, we have just seen Emu worried or concerned or reactive to a situation, and that situation was Joy Boy. Cut to the Sunny flying through the air, where it just so happens to land perfectly next to the Giant's ship. And we are shown a couple of the ships in the background going after them. The Giants question what just happened and the fact that a robot has haki and how that doesn't make sense, but that which might actually tie to the scene where Frankie, Bonnie and Luffy did the triple attack, and it was said that haki was sensed from somebody, indicating that it could have actually been Frankie, another robot with haki. Usopp and Chopper hug Jinbei and sort of get super excited that they survived, adding a bit of context that Jinbei's helmsmanship helped the situation. But then we cut back onto Egghead Island, where we just see Saturn in his human form stood opposite Emeth. Then we get a flashback, which is very reminiscent of the panel we just saw with Saturn stood opposite Emeth, but instead it's Joy Boy sat opposite Emeth. For the first time, we see a strong silhouette of Joy Boy with the straw hat and a turned-up collar on what we can assume is some sort of pirate jacket. He tells Emeth he's going to gather his most powerful haki and seal it inside him. Joy Boy explains he's doing this because Emeth will live far longer than Joy Boy will, softly suggesting that Joy Boy could be human. Joy Boy explains that at some point Emeth will want to save somebody or save himself, and in that situation untie the knot and everything will be okay. We get a very interesting quote from Joy Boy as well, which says, "Whenever it happens, I'll be saving you from here in the past, just like always." This is a pretty strange quote and kind of evokes the idea of like time travel or time manipulation, which we do see with Toki, and we do see with kind of the whole underlying checkered fate motif, which is that like what happened 800 years ago is kind of re-happening now, right? Next we have a very interesting line, even though many would have probably missed it, from Emeth. He says, haha, that makes me very happy, blah, blah, blah. But he also says, I hope, ... I don't get lonely, ... right? This is very interesting because Frankie says to Brook, when he first discovers Brook's situation, Frankie says, how did you not get lonely all that time on your own? Which implies that Frankie was lonely when he was, adrift on that ship rebuilding himself. And now we have Emeth, who's a mech with haki and a soul, saying that he hopes he doesn't get lonely. So loneliness seems to be a bit of a theme between these guys. And that's pretty much it for 1122, but now we move on to 1123. The Void Fortnight, and not the fortnight like the game, but fortnight like 2 weeks, and the Void being reminiscent of the Void Century. We go back to Yamato's cover story. I won't go into too much detail with Yamato's cover story, because very similar to the Wano arc, it is incredibly deep. It needs its own explanation. Each scene is indicative of Odin and of Joy Boy. Not just that, but the history of Wano through the children. We see children stealing, which we saw with Denjiro, Orochi, and Odin. And then we see them being turned into sort of good people, which is the direction Denjiro went in, as opposed to the direction Orochi went in. So, in summary, we could say we're seeing a reformation of Wano through this part of Yamato's cover story. However, it will change as time goes on, and we'll see a lot more exotic scenes that don't necessarily include Wano, and probably will have some lore drops. So, as I say, I won't go too much into detail on the others. The chapter starts with just loads of shots of Marines and Vice Admirals that are either turned into a child, knocked out, or both. The only person that doesn't seem affected by this is S-Snake, who's trying to wake everyone else up, but the comms are coming through from HQ and they're not responding, so HQ is starting to realise something's not right. The Elbathian giants sort of look at the island with some binoculars, check everything that's going on. They see that everyone's wiped out and they're still kind of like amazed by this, after which Luffy says thank you to Emeth with his classic laugh, she, and he does a very big Gear 5 smile, and we see a lifeless Emeth basically just stood there. And just like that, the whole ship goes off to Elbath and we leave Egghead. We have a few shots of the crew. For example, Bonnie is in her child form hugging Kuma. Zoro breathes a sigh of relief. Usopp's crying with happiness and he's just overjoyed to be with the giants, and again we're shown him with Chopper. Luffy is being held in a very interesting position by Nami, but he's basically really old, tongue sticking out, looks like a testicle. We get a few flashes to Vegapunk, who's like not looking too good, and he talks to Sanji and explains the situation. And that's when we get the breakdown that 2 weeks ago, Shaka detected a traitor, and 3 of the Vegapunks basically jump into action and start trying to work out who it is. They quickly realize it's York, and they realize they're going to have to erase some memories, so Vegapunk leaves himself a load of messages and records a message to the rest of the world. Then he accepts that he's going to die, and then the 3 Vegapunks have their memory erased. However, there is one interesting panel where Shaka actually questions what death actually means for somebody like Vegapunk. His brain is revealed to be kept in a humongous tank, and later on we are shown different body parts of Vegapunk, so he can be rebuilt, which does make sense considering he's an ultra super giga genius, right? But it also touches on the broader theme of what life is in One Piece, what death is. We know that, some people when they die their souls go into trees, or so believed. In Wano with the Fire Festival, they send messages up to the dead to communicate with them. So this is Oda sort of open and exploring some deeper concepts, which are going to become more relevant as the story goes on. Straight after this as well, we get a panel where they say they also have to save the artificial island clouds, and that they may be pivotal in saving humanity in the near future. Very interesting. Kind of touches on Wivaria vibes, which links the whole Mother Flame. In Wivaria we saw the flames inside the bubbles, and now we've seen the Mother Flame, which looks quite similar. But not just that, it just brings up the whole Sky Island vibe and just a load of possibilities. Not only this, but we know that Balloon Terminal, where Rouge is around Kid's base, and that is further down the Grand Line, so that should be coming up soon. And as I say, Rouge was on Balloon Terminal, and we're expecting to see him too, right? So all of this cloud stuff seems like it will be tying in soon anyway. Next, we see sort of the rest of the events with the 3 Vegapunks as they erase their memories and wake up and read the note and then put their plan into action. After which we join back to the present, and that's Sanji kind of all filled in with everything he needs to know, and he can essentially go back and tell the crew. The chapter ends with an almost full-page panel of a massive giant pie and them holding on to Luffy, who looks like a breadstick. He's so skinny at this point, and yeah, he's asking them to wait for him so he can feel better and party with them. Okay, and on to chapter 1124, titled Best Friend. In the cover page, we're shown Yamato basically fend off a kidnapping as they make a pilgrimage to the shrine. I said earlier that I'm not going to go too into detail, and this is kind of why. The Inari Shrine is super spicy in One Piece. It ties to Kuina, it ties to Denjiro's transformation, and also we have somebody trying to kidnap a child, which isn't just some arbitrary choice from Oda. It's relevant, it ties into the history of Wano. But we move on. We start the chapter with Big News Morgan, Vivi, and Wapol, right? So no complaints there, everyone loves it. Morgan exclaims that he wants to make desperation so he can make more sales with his newspapers. And then Vivi is shown to reply, that's gross. Even Vegapunk showed some optimism. And for some reason, whether or not it's an artistic mistake or what, which I believe it is personally because there's no background at all, so it's like the panel was unfinished, Vivi's left eye is just completely closed, the right eye completely open. So unless she's got something in her eye, or there's like some sort of booger scene that I've missed, like before when the boogers are getting passed around and she's got a booger in her eye, I think that's just a mistake. And as I say, that's evidenced by the fact that there's no background, whereas all the other panels have a background. Kind of reminiscent of the ending of Bleach, but let's not get into that. Morgans also threatens Vivi and says basically, mind your own business or I'll expose you. To which Vivi basically doesn't give a shit, and she says no one's going to believe this propaganda you're pushing. And we get a few ladies in the background reacting with love hearts to Vivi's sort of defiance. There's not too much going on here, but it is kind of symbolic that, Vivi, someone who a lot of us speculate is going to come into power by the end of the story, is demanding the truth, is demanding true news, as opposed to propaganda, which is what the world government are all about. Morgans basically talks about the fact that he cannot pass up the opportunity and explicitly says the whole world's sinking and that he's top dog in the sky anyway. So that the upcoming era is actually perfect for Morgan. You could probably unpack a few things here, particularly with what was said about the Torinomis in Alabasta and their significance, and just Like, you know, we don't see many planes or any planes really, except for in cover stories. It might tie into the whole clouds thing that Vegapunk was talking about, the fact that Lunarians used to live in the sky, the Sky Races used to live in the sky, hence the name Sky Races. But yeah, I'll let you guys connect the dots and throw some comments down if you've got any ideas. Vivi then gives us another Chad moment where she says, if the world is ending anyway, I'm not just going to grovel to save my own neck. Okay, so we cut back to Egghead with a very detailed, huge panel that shows the ships all sort of wavering around in the swell of the sea, which has been disturbed by all the events that we've just seen. We also see punk records floating high in the sky amongst the clouds, and in the foreground we see Sentomaru in a little rowing boat, basically, just absolutely pacing it out of there. We hear a voice over the Den Den Mushi, but everyone's still passed out except for one person, which is Kizaru, who strolls over and answers the Den Den. Akainu asks basically why everyone's knocked out and what's going on with Saturn, implying that he doesn't know that the rest of the Gorosei have teleported with some super cool black magic symbols, and basically just has no idea of what's actually going on. Next thing we know, we get kind of a belated flashback from Kizaru where he explains, or where it's revealed that, you know, he's got deep ties to his best friend Vegapunk and he loves him so much, and then he had to kill him. And then we get a real nice panel of him sort of, it cuts back to the present and he's just crying behind his glasses and he's like shouting at Akainu, basically saying, chill dude, like I've just killed my best mate and I'm not in a good place. To which Akainu surprisingly replies, that was my bad, brother, which is kind of interesting. We've never seen a soft side to Akainu before. Now cut back to the sea where the Sunny and the giant ship are just sailing next to each other, and people on the Sunny are saying that it's so quiet. They talk about the fact that there wasn't actually a party, it was called off after a single drink just because Luffy was just too messed up. And also they lament the fact that they failed their main goal, which is to protect Vegapunk, something that really wasn't focused on much at the end of the Egghead arc as a whole. The Straw Hats went to Egghead and basically had the whole island destroyed, Vegapunk is dead, the world is changed. So although like this is just a side effect of Luffy being the sun god and stuff like that, the events that have just happened are catastrophic and extreme. The whole world is now aware that there's true history being hidden from them. But Frankie does retort that they did have to compete with 5 elders, an admiral, Cypherpole Zero, the Seraphim, and a whole armada of warships, and just for some reason they happened to survive. So it's not like they just completely blundered it. Zoro seems pretty pissed off though. He says it's pathetic. He's an emperor now. An old man dying shouldn't affect him this badly. That is interesting. But then next thing we know, Lilith awakes. Lilith wakes up from her little sleepy, and pretty much instantly her radio set goes off. We're now on the giant ship on a sofa with Usopp, Chopper, Nami, Sanji and Lilith. We get a beautiful shot of inside the ship where the sofa is just absolutely colossal and our Straw Hats are tiny. They have their own little ladder so they can get up onto the sofa. But then suddenly she stops crying and she says, "Hey, I'm hungry." And she explains it must be because she's no longer connected to York. Do not ask me how that works. Absolute Deus Ex business, but suddenly Lilith's completely independent, York's completely independent, so I don't know. It's a bit cheap, but that's happened. They tell Lilith there's a table full of fruit, so she goes over to the table and she's introduced to the table by Brook in quite a strange pose. And he says, the atmosphere from that table seems a bit gloomy, doesn't it? And there's tons of black lines drawn on the panel, sort of showing this dark vibe, right? So we get this image that Brook, this kind of the ferryman to death, like the ferryman of the River Styx, you know, who controls the passage between life and death. He introduces Luffy, who's at that table, who's absolutely mourning Vegapunk's death. The effect that this has on Luffy is that he eats slower, so I'm not sure if that's relevant. They question Lilith as to why she's okay, and basically she replies, everyone's alive. All the giants and the Straw Hats are just so surprised, and Lilith goes on to explain even if they're functionally dead, they still live on in some way. To which one of the characters replies, so they're ghosts? Which is a cool little highlighting of the fact, like, ghost vibes, emu vibes, you know, like yokai vibes, all that sort of undead stuff. Which I explained earlier is kind of a more important theme, you know, death and what death means in One Piece. But since eating, Luffy has become his normal self again. He's not old anymore, he's restored, and he does start smiling, and eventually they do start partying. This gives us sort of a double page setup where there's just a huge party going on, and that's the end of the Egghead arc officially done. And then the last panel is somebody drinking a bottle saying, "Come on then," who's assumably sat on Elbaf, because the narrator's note says what awaits them in the land of the giants. And that concludes the chapter. We had a break after that chapter, and then the following week we went into 1125. So what constitutes death is the title, and that's something I've been bringing up over the past couple chapters, right? So it's important here, and the best way I can probably describe it is to use the Gorosei. We have 5 Gorosei. The first one was science, which both in the East and the West we can all strongly relate to. And each Gorosei, we're probably going to get a bit more abstract as to the concept. Wano, for example, is very spiritual, whereas Saturn and Egghead was very mechanical. So it will get more complex, and what constitutes death as a title is very important. It also ties to the cover story where we see Yamato on her journey, and we see in the background that Odin's castle is being rebuilt. Okay, so why is this significant? Just to give a brief explanation, Odin's castle was actually ran by Toki Amatsuki. So he left and she was running it. And that's most likely because Kuri was naturally the Amatsuki region. And now with the death of Orochi and the reformation of Wano, it'll be Hiyori that takes on Odin's castle, right? Because Hiyori was there with the whole Orochi scene. She was playing the shamisen, and she's a pure Amatsuki. And she's got the Amatsuki blood, she's got the Amatsuki hair, and her father was a Kazuki. So again, I won't go into too much detail, but there is a lot of backstory going on about the history of Wano here and stuff that we can kind of glean, but it's very deep and we'd have to work it out. One additional detail is somebody in the panel that's doing the reconstruction has the Kiyashiro family crest on his kimono, which is reminiscent of Denjiro, right? Because Denjiro, when Orochi died and he cut off Orochi's head, Denjiro is the loyalist retainer of the Amatsuki and the Kozuki. But let's move on. So we're back at Egghead again. The island's still on fire, things are not looking good, Punk Records is still floating in the sky, and we see Lucci and Kaku board the ship. They ask what happened to Stussy. Lucci replies that she was killed in action, and Kaku is pretty upset about this. He's definitely more upset than Lucci, showing a far more emotional and attached sort of situation. One additional detail is Hattori flew off Lucci's shoulder when he was bitten by Stussy, I believe it was, and now he's back here. He's a bit ashened up, he's a bit messy, but he's back on Lucci's shoulder. Nothing said about it. Sus as always. Lucci does say, however, we obtained everything we set out for. We then have a panel of Saturn who says, with York, Punk Records and the power station in hand, we have secured access to the eternal mother flame. So before, Lilith mentioned that the island runs on fire energy and it would be ideal if they could have an eternal flame. They also developed the mother flame, and with all these resources combined, you can make the eternal mother flame. Bear in mind how late we are in the story and the fact our protagonist is a sun god, a fiery god. It definitely implies connections to Laugh Tale and what the One Piece actually might be or could be tied to. The camera, so to speak, goes behind Saturn and we see that who he's talking to is the Vice Admirals, and he's given them a pretty stern telling off, to which they reply they want to, make amends by going to Elbaf. However, Saturn says the mistake that they made is far more dire than letting the Straw Hats escape. The main mistake was letting Vegapunk's message get out there. We then get a flashback of Saturn basically giving the Iron Giant to some scientists and them thanking him and being very happy that they've got the opportunity. But then it cuts back to the present, and one of the Vice Admirals basically starts asking if Vegapunk's message is true. And Saturn pretty much reactively looks at him, just gives him the stare of death, and the guy just passes out, blood coming out of his nose and eyes and all sorts. Then we're shown York, who's actually on Egghead Island, and she notices that the cloud machine just will not stop making clouds. It's just pumping them out non-stop. York grabs the bazooka and says it must be Edison who's responsible. for this and fires the weapon at the Cloud Factory. We see a little darkened panel of just Edison's eye where he laughs and says bingo. What Edison gets her to shoot basically disconnects the top of Punk Records from the bottom, and with all the clouds being made, it takes the top up into the sky. Okay, next we move to Marijois and we see the Celestials freaking out about Vegapunk's message, saying that it can't be true. What's Akainu doing? He hasn't even sorted out the Kuma situation yet since Kuma escaped. But we do see some of the Celestials saying that the floods won't affect them because they live in Marijois. We see one of the Celestial Dragons at dinner and he's got like a 5 o'clock shadow, so kind of like he hasn't been shaving, right? And he's also shouting at his chef. Now, the Celestial Dragon is shouting because he ordered beef and he's been served fish, showing that like they're using the local resources since the siege has affected their own meat supplies. But the Celestial Dragon is still kind of a chubby guy, whereas the chef is shown to be very, very scrawny, suggesting that the people that work for him, the slaves and stuff, are undernourished. But then the Celestial shoots the chef and kills him, which we can assume, you know, is going to lead to a situation where if they kill all their workers, they're not going to know how to survive. They're not going to know how to cook their own food and stuff like that, so they'll probably just die out or become dependent. We just generally get a sense that they're not very happy and they're starting to revolt. Now we get one of the coolest scenes I've ever seen in One Piece, which is just Garling strolling in to the throne room towards the Gorosei, and the Gorosei are like, what are you doing here, dude? And he's like, new orders have been bestowed upon me. And he says, the Vegapunk known as York shall henceforth be under my supervision, because he was just named the new defense science warrior god. Mars replies, don't tell me, which is basically saying, like, you know, he knows Saturn's about to get squished. Garling says the world is heading for turmoil. An unprecedented level of rebellion is imminent. This kind of is interesting because it suggests that it's even worse than the sort of events that preceded the Void Century, but I doubt that's true. I imagine it's just what he knows of history. This is as bad as it gets, right? Because the true history is hidden. He also makes a statement to the Gorosei saying, let us work together to better the world, my fellow elders. So this is one of the first times we get a direct and explicit motivation from one of the Gorosei, which is Garling saying he wants to better the world. Whether or not this is true or just some sort of play on words, we'll find out. So that's Garling sat in Saturn's seat, basically. That's a lot of S's. And we cut immediately back to Saturn, who is on Egghead and is basically starting to have his soul sucked out in front of all the Vice Admirals. The Vice Admirals state that they need to do something to protect him because he's their superior. And interestingly, one of them questions what's happening as some sort of disease, which will become more and more important as we go on and we sort of move towards the relationship between Emu and Lily. Stuff like love sickness, amber lead sickness, even the 5-day disease, all of these things, which will be revealed that like the Gorosei were a part of, or they're partly responsible for this sort of these diseases and stuff. The only thing that Saturn says is, no, it can't be, And what we see, right, this is interesting. We see all of him deteriorating, and the very last thing we see of him alive is his eye looking. You know, his eyes are completely disappeared, and he says, Emu-sama, and that's it. We then cut to Emu's eye, and Emu talking directly to Saturn, saying, Saturn, Joy Boy, was behind that escape, and you allowed it to happen. Saturn becomes some weird, silhouetted, stretchy yokai blob and sort of like makes some weird noises that are akin to, have mercy, how could I anticipate that power foiling us? And there's a huge Haki explosion, which leaves completely no trace of Saturn except for bones. Interesting. We don't know how Brook died, right? And he's a skeleton, so it seems a little bit strange, but yeah, let's not get too into that. Moving on. We cut to the top of Egghead that's just flying through the sky like a massive Starlink, and we see all the surviving Vegapunks chipping in. After which we're shown a panel of like what they look like when they've all kind of come together as, you know, like Atlas's left arm, Pythagoras' right arm, Edison's head, Shaka's jacket. And at the end of this little scene, we see Edison contacting the wizard at Wiveria that taught Nami during the time skip. Which is interesting, right? Because, as I said before, we've got the clouds, the top of Egghead's flying around. We have Balloon Terminal with a rouge on it, which should become relevant. We have Wiveria, which in itself is relevant to Nami, and like weather means power, potentially, stuff like that. And on we move to Kamabaka Queendom. We have some of the revolutionaries basically questioning what's going on with the floods, and we see them saying the Void Century covered up a massive war, and that it culminated in ancient weapons technology, plunging the world 200 meters deeper into the ocean. Now, it's an interesting use of words because it says plunging, right? Like the Earth was pushed 200 meters down, whereas we're sort of assuming that the flood's gone 200 meters up. I mean, it's confusing, but that's the details we've been given. So basically, there was a Void Century. The point of the Void Century was to cover up a massive war. That war culminated in ancient weapons technology, which resulted in the world being plunged 200 meters deeper into the ocean. They also go on to say whoever reaches Laugh-Tale and becomes Pirate King might have access to all this devastating power, and that they can't let that happen. Sabo goes on to say that it explains why the Celestial Dragons moved up to on top of the Red Line because it's the highest point on Earth. But that also tells us that it also reaffirms to us that the Red Line was there before the 20 Kingdoms Alliance and Emu was up there, which we already kind of had suggested through the fact that we were told Lunarians were on the Red Line before the Celestials. Eva speculates that this might be why they're making Tequila Wolf, Vodka Wolf, Rum Wolf, and Bourbon Wolf, but for the past 700 years, which is a big reveal because we only previously knew about Tequila Wolf. Now, I've seen a lot of people speculating all these different ideas, but this is a lot simpler than people think, right, in my opinion. The 4 seas make the all blue together, right? And this 4 bridges make the all land together. All the bridges are named after alcohols, so them 4 alcohols, right, probably together with some other, green ingredient or something like that, probably creates Binks sake, which is the equivalent of like what Sanji wants from the all blue, right? He wants to make food from the all blue. Binks sake will be a liquid, whereas on the all land, the meeting point of all the 4 bridges, you will have on the land, you will have a liquid, which is Binks sake, right? And the reason why we think it's Binks sake is because of all the alcohol involved and just sort of the significant nature of what it means to bring all 4 places that are split up together and unify them.